I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for our MBA Academy, Understanding the Business of Climate. We're going to have an amazing conversation today around systems change and specifically around decarbonizing the fashion supply chain. But first, my name is Jessica Wingert. I'm the program lead for ClimateCAP based here out of Duke's Fuqua School of Business. I'm going to take the first minute or two to introduce ClimateCAP. I saw we had a lot of new registrations, new faces in our registration, so we're excited to have you here. If you aren't familiar, ClimateCAP is an organization founded around the mission to prepare tomorrow's business leaders, which is many of you here today, to understand and respond to the climate challenge by mainstreaming the climate conversation in business schools. ClimateCAP was founded and continues to be led by us here at Fuqua, but we are a global partnership of 44 business schools, and we work really closely with the staff and faculty at those schools on a number of different initiatives, including our annual MBA Summit, our ClimateCAP Fellowship, and our MBA Academy Virtual Learning Series. If you haven't yet signed up for our mailing list, I highly suggest that you do so you can stay up to date on all of these different events. I just mentioned our 44 partner schools and wanted to highlight some of those schools which support ClimateCAP at the leading and supporting partnership level. And we'd like to thank them for helping to make this program and a lot of our other initiatives possible. For those of you who are MBAs and aren't yet a partner school, feel free to reach out if you have any questions on how to become one. And for those of you who aren't yet MBAs, you can access links to all of these schools directly on our website. Wanted to highlight one of our programs that we actually just wrapped up a few weeks ago, and hopefully you've heard of our ClimateCAP MBA Summit, but this is really our flagship event every year, bringing together hundreds of MBA students from around the country to meet and discuss the climate and business. We just finished up our summit at Ross a few weeks ago, and the recordings of those sessions are all available on our website as well as on our YouTube page. There were some really incredible conversations, so I highly suggest that you check those out. And we're also excited to announce that we will be headed to the Berkeley Haas School of Business next February for our 2025 summit. So save the dates. Next, I want to highlight our ClimateCAP MBA Fellowship, which empowers 12 fellows every year to become the next climate leaders and change makers. And key elements of this fellowship include learning and development sessions, networking, and self-directed project work, where students design and implement climate action projects. Throughout the fellowship, they receive mentorship and also attend a lot of cohort building activities virtually. We just welcomed our second cohort in January, and you can learn more about them as well as previous cohorts on our website. For those of you who are still in school, we will be accepting applications for our next cohort of fellows in the fall. And last but certainly not least, to highlight why we are all here today, I wanted to mention our MBA MBA Academy Virtual Learning Series, which we continue out through the school year. We're really excited to bring these thought leaders to you directly, so please check out our website, climatecap.org, to register for future events, as well as to see recordings of events that we've had in the past. After today, our next session will be on April 5th with Allison Taylor from NYU's Stern School of Business, talking about businesses doing the right thing in a turbulent world. But with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today, the reason that you're all here. And so we've got two speakers, and we're really excited to have both of them. First, Wesley Longhofer is an associate professor of organization and management at the Goizueta Business School at Emory University, where he also serves as the executive academic director of its Business and Society Institute. His research on climate change in the energy sector has been funded by the National Science Foundation and featured in the Washington Post and Nature Climate Change. His co-authored book, Superpolluters: Tackling the World's Largest Sites of Climate-Disrupting Emissions, was published by Columbia University Press in 2020. Wes will be in conversation with Lewis Perkins, who is the president of the Apparel Impact Institute, an organization launched by leading brands and apparel sector industry associations to identify, fund, and scale programs to drive positive impact in the fashion sector. Previous to this, Perkins was the president of the Cradle to Cradle Products and Innovation Institute, where he launched the Institute's Fashion Positive Initiative, which engages designers, manufacturers, brands, and influencers in creating cradle to cradle certified materials and products within the circular economy in mind. Prior to joining Cradle to Cradle, Perkins led sustainability for the Mohawk Group and consulted with corporations and organizations on their social and environmental programs. In addition to all of his professional accomplishments, I'd like to highlight that he's also served as an Ashoka Strategy Thought Partner, a member of the H&M Global Change Award Expert Panel, and a design mentor for both the Council of Fashion Designers of America, as well as the IDEO and Ellen MacArthur Foundation's new Plastics Economy Circular Design Competition. Perkins has also been a participant in the World Economic Forum's Global Forum Future on Consumption. Lewis holds his MBA from Goizueta Business School and a Bachelor in Arts from Washington and Lee University. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wes and Lewis. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Jessica. Lewis, it's good to see you. It looks like it's a beautiful day in San Francisco.
Well, it is, although what's behind, clearly I'm not over here in Marin looking, or actually this is the view from San Francisco to Marin. But it's right over there. So I'm in the Bay Area. That's correct. And it is a nice day. It's a nice day out here.
Well, Lewis, it's always great to chat with you. You've come to my class, and some of my students have worked for you. But for those of you that in the audience that don't know you, let's start with just a little bit about your journey. You got your MBA Goizueta in 2000, did some development work for the Clean Air Campaign, found yourself at Mohawk, Cradle to Cradle. What led you to want to decarbonize the fashion industry through the Apparel Impact Institute?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, the common thread around my interest in this work has been kind of the corporate social responsibility piece. I've been working in that space, whether it was when I was a student, but also during internship I did with BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, during my Goizueta days. But even going back to early days when I was doing fundraising in Atlanta around the Olympic Games, for the Cultural Olympiad and the High Museum of Art, looking at art exhibits, it's constantly been this interest of mine to look at how corporations leverage their social and environmental work, and how potentially the role that they play over what's been my lifetime and career lifetime has shifted from more of a maybe sponsorship philanthropic view of this work to actually embedding it deeply into core business. And so the apparel sector has been one that's continuously emerged for me as a great example of how one sector addresses everything from extraction of raw materials and fiber sheds at the raw material level, all the way through the waste that we're producing that ends up in global landfills. And so I've spent the last 10 plus years really focusing on this particular sector and how it also intersects with so many other areas of food and ag, of energy grids, of global labor and production. So yeah.
So the focus of this session is activating systems change, and systems change is something that is very trendy right now in business schools. Business schools, teach you how to optimize things. We typically have not taught systems change, but you're starting to see this shift. And I take a lot of inspiration from Donella Meadows' idea of systems change and like which levers can you pull to activate change in a system. But before we get to those different levers, tell us more about the Apparel Impact Institute. What is your theory of change, and what does systems change look like to you all?
Sure. Yeah. The theory of change for AII, I'll make it easier, I'll call us AII, is really around the collective action piece of convening multiple stakeholders in a sector. And it started with the brand retailer side, where going back, 6 or 7 years ago, a group of brand retailers were working together on collecting data sets related to environmental performance and social performance in the supply chain, or the impact of it. And the conversation was really moving toward knowing your impact is one thing, but when you don't own your supply chain, you have very little leverage over them other than potentially longer term partnership agreements, or there's things we can try to do. And yet what consistently kept coming up for this sector was we actually need to start driving a consistent message and strategy into the supply chain around clean energy, around technology, innovation, that otherwise we're all coming to the same major suppliers with different messages that is making it harder to actually affect change. And so the theory of change of AII was not only let's work together, but let's actually scale solutions together, and let's get existing programs that maybe are working across the finish line, and let's also identify things in the innovation gap together. So rather than have all these individual pilot projects that are proprietary, and maybe you see a press release that, Nike's working on a new material for something, and then you never hear about it again, like what happened to that project? So it was really applying a design thinking approach to that had more transparency, where we're all going to get around the virtual table, the proverbial table, and we're going to start solving these problems together and start scaling together. So our mission statement is to identify, fund, scale, and measure proven solutions. And sometimes just figuring out what those proven solutions are and agreeing on getting them to scale is step one. And so that's what we're working on right now. And then moving into some of the deeper innovations that are ready for scalability.
So let's talk about funds. And so one way to start to understand a system is to understand how resources kind of flow through that system. And you have the fashion fund that you're trying to build. So AI is trying to raise $250 million to unlock $2 billion need to get the entire fashion industry to net zero by 2050. Tell us more about that fund. Where's it coming from? Where's it at? How's 250 million going to unlock 2 billion? I'm fascinated.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if we step back to how we were set up to work, it was to actually pool resources from these brand retailers, and then to go, we sign NDAs with them. We look at their supply chain lists, and a lot of them are in a real push to gain even more transparency, because in this sector, you may know who your direct supplier is that's cutting and sewing your final product, but you may not know where the fabric came from. You may not know where the yarn or the raw materials came from. So this whole, to know your impact, you actually have to know the whole supply chain, right? And so there's been a tremendous push, which I would say is the last 10 to 15 years of this sector's work. So when they got to a point where they said, let's work together, then it made sense to say, let's look at where we overlap. Let's look at the countries, the regions, and maybe even specific suppliers that we're all sourcing from. And let's start there by sending a common message. So rather than one of us subsidizing or funding project work in a country or with a supplier, if we pool our resources, it's a lot more powerful. It also lowers the cost, and we can gain more reach, right? So based on that, and based on the ambition of the sector when we launched, which was for carbon emissions, let alone everything else we're looking at, when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN, I mean, every single one of them is impacted or could be affected through this particular sector. And so when you look at the decarbonization and the climate one, it was important to recognize that, we don't own the supply chain, but we are driving up to 10% of carbon emissions globally through our production of apparel. And we estimated just the scope 3 emissions of this was at a minimum 2% of carbon emissions, but it could be much larger than that. And that was based on the data sets we had. So to answer your question, what we decided to do was work with companies to pool their resources. And so a lot of these budgets were pretty small, and yet the task at hand was pretty large. And so if you pool them, then you've got a little bit more money to work with, and you're distributing across the shared supply chain. But we were working with World Resource Institute on trying to understand, where is the carbon? What are those big, again, systems change, those big levers that we need to be pulling in terms of carbon, which I'll talk more about that later. So once we knew where the carbon was, from raw materials all the way through final stage cut and sew assembly, then we would also need to know how much it's going to cost. So we worked with HSBC Bank and a group called Fashion for Good out of the Netherlands to build a report called Unlocking the $1 Trillion Opportunity to Decarbonize Fashion. And one of the things that report revealed to us was we were going to need a ton of catalytic capital that didn't require an ROI, a ton of it, but that would unlock 8 to 10x of debt and equity from existing commercial banks, development banks, funds, government funds, et cetera. So we used the modeling in that report to say, okay, what can we as an organization take on? And it was 100 million in philanthropy that I really put a stake in the ground and just said, let's pick a number and then model out what that would look like. And 100 million in philanthropic would also potentially unlock 150 million in corporate brand treasury dollars for supply chain improvement and subsidy work. And that would unlock another 150 million in manufacturer support. This is before you start even investing in capital expenditures. So then that would unlock another, another 1.75 billion in debt and equity coming from outside. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. We can create a pooled fund at the $250 million level, take it to factories, suppliers, and subsidize and complement what their existing budgets may be for this work. Again, all that non-ROI related activity, which I can go into what that looks like. And then that would signal the market and de-risk and identify solutions that the industry is ready to scale, which would then attract and bring in other asset classes for a whole kind of blended capital stack approach to this work. So all of a sudden, we modeled it out and we were at the 2 billion and we put a stake in the ground and announced that's what we would do. Second part of your question is, where are we? So the goal of the 250 million is to raise it up and spend it down by 2030 so that we can remove 100 million tons of carbon. This is just a demonstration that we want everybody else to copy us. We hope what we're doing is establishing systems change. We're establishing what it looks like to do this work and that others will replicate. So as an NGO nonprofit, we publish everything we do, we share it, and we want to be copied, right? So currently, we've attracted the first 70 million in, which is excellent because that's going to help us, unlock. Again, we can start deploying that immediately, which we have been, and then we can unlock more capital coming from the financial institutions. And I'll share with you, who those are, because we've already pulled together and assembled, I guess, a stakeholder engagement or community of practice of commercial banks, development banks, and brand treasury, brand philanthropy, and supplier finance as well. So we pulled that all together.
So I understand that. So pulling the money together is I see it as the catalyst for unlocking the debt and equity, and like I see that how that chain works. But the industry itself is still structured in the same way, that these brands don't own the suppliers, and there's dozens and dozens and dozens of them. So how do you get the incentives right? And where do you start when it comes to those incentive structures?
That's really important because depending on who you ask, we either have a problem with access to capital, or we have plenty of capital and it's not access isn't the problem. And so one of the things we realize, it's both and, right? You've got small, medium enterprises who are having a really hard time getting attractive loans, in this case, to be able to take on some of these factory improvements, renewable energy implementation, replacing equipment with better equipment. And, we've modeled out what all those interventions are in our roadmap report with WRI. But now it's like, okay, some of them may need that and be able to create de-risked finance, lower interest rates, below market rates, all that. So that's true. But for a lot of the bigger suppliers who don't necessarily have a problem with the access to capital or the availability of credit, or even their own corporate treasuries may be strong enough to do a lot of this work without taking on debt, they're not incentivized to do it if they don't have some line of sight that this industry is going to, of the brand retailer side, is going to continue to work with them beyond just one collection or season. So for people who are kind of new to this sector, I'll explain how a lot of it works. This isn't all of it, because when you look at, whether it's performance, athletic footwear, or luxury, you do have long-term partnerships. You do have suppliers who have been working closely on innovation and R&D and long-term relationships for production with brand retailers. But the majority of it's not that way. The majority of it is a very movable tail of the supply chain, which is based on pricing, which is that I want to make this jacket, I bid out, to a multiple suppliers, and the lowest bid who can also meet my timeline, my performance, or like it's made the quality that I want, I can get it in the time frame that I want, and it's the price point that I want. That's who I go with, which means that as a sourcing department at a brand retailer, I may be moving between suppliers, constantly. So one of the things that we recognize is that changing the infrastructure or the system is going to be critical. And it's probably the hardest part of this. It's actually not attracting trillions or billions of dollars. The hardest part of this is changing the system. So happy to share more about what we're doing around that. But ultimately, we have got to incentivize suppliers in a way that brings them some type of understanding that they're going to be invested in longer term than just one season or one collection. And one of the ways we look at doing that is by creating this whole consortium and portfolio of volume where one brand retailer may move between suppliers, but if you get a consortium of enough brand retailers in a region or around a group of suppliers, could we begin to lean into some kind of preferred vendor volume commitment based on meeting climate criteria? If you are lowering your carbon emissions by a certain threshold over a certain timeline, you qualify for a certain agreement we've made as a group of brands to step into this work. That's what we're working on and trying to get to. And it's not going to be easy, but we've got a pretty active working group of companies, suppliers and brand retailers at the table trying to figure out how we can start to change the current structure, at least to demonstrate what that can look like, so that, again, if it's proven successful, it can be replicated.
I'm a professor that loves to run a very interactive classroom, and so we're getting some questions in from our audience. So I'm going to kind of weave those in as we go along. But you had mentioned that 10 to 15 years ago, the fashion industry and the supply chain started to shift a little bit, more transparency. Catherine asks, are there other industries with better transparency and tracking across the supply chain that you look to as potential models for how to accelerate that work?
That's great. I mean, I think when you look at like electronics and other, home goods, durable, hard goods, there tends to be, more vertical integration also. I mean, that's the key. If there was vertical integration in this sector at a larger scale, you'd start there, and that would be a lot easier to replicate. But I do think, when we're looking at the regions and the industrial parks that the textiles are being produced, oftentimes they do cluster by product category where, all the cut and sew t-shirts or all the denim or all the footwear clusters, but oftentimes you'll see other industries that are in there as well too. And so we also know that if we're looking at not just on-site interventions for one particular type of production facility, but we're actually looking at a whole industrial complex, then clean energy and renewable energy, battery storage, thermal heat innovation, all that can kind of look larger. So we're in the process now of reaching out across other sectors, particularly with some of our RFPs for our grant making around looking at what's working in other sectors, particularly where thermal heat has been applied. So I'd say there's a lot more we can be doing to cross-pollinate with other industries and learn from them. But yeah, there are definitely sectors that I think have done this better because they do have longer term agreements with their suppliers.
So one of the things that AI does is, and I think this speaks to the incentives, are you deploy grants to try and catalyze some of these sustainability solutions at the factory levels. Some of these are shown to be scalable, like Clean by Design, that helps for tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. Some of these are kind of further upstream with tier 4, like your leaf color charts that provide cotton farmers with more information about how for fertilizer recommendations. Tell us more about that grants program, and what are some of the innovations coming on in the future that you're really excited about that could really help the industry?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And so if you think about this, kind of answering that question also with one that you had earlier, which is like, what is this role of this catalytic capital that we're attracting? And so with our lead partners and then, 60 plus other brand retailers that we're working with, we actually go much larger than the 70 million we've identified. And so we've got this line of sight with this pooled resources that we apply in a couple ways. And so the first one is providing technical assistance on the ground to suppliers, so we can go in and underwrite or subsidize, and it comes in the form of a grant or maybe subsidy or complementing their existing budget, quite simply as doing technical assistance, benchmarking their carbon emissions, doing an evaluation of their production, looking at efficiency opportunities, making recommendations around efficiency. We pay for technical experts, third-party on the ground engineers and technical, groups that we partner with in different countries to do that work. So that's one way in which we're providing those non-return on investment dollars. But the second piece that this Fashion Climate Fund has helped us really activate is that larger grant making pool to say, in addition to the factory subsidy, can we find existing programs, other NGOs, solution providers, innovators of new technologies or solutions that are out there? Maybe they're working in another sector. Maybe they're doing some regenerative ag projects in a food sector, but it would be applicable to cotton production. Or maybe it's some type of thermal heat, electrifying boilers that's happening in another sector, but we could potentially fund them to start bringing their project work over to the thermal heat production of wet processing of dyeing fabrics, you know? So this is the kind of stuff we're looking for. So we put out a year ago the first RFP. We just announced we're in a current open one again right now. And so those grants are looking at everything from lowering carbon in the production of raw materials, lowering carbon in the efficiency work that happens in those facilities. I've mentioned thermal heat a couple times. That's a huge one. That's actually over 50% of the carbon emissions of this sector in their scope 3. And scope 3 is 97% of their emissions. So it's basically half of the carbon is coming from on-site coal and other fossil fuels being burned to get temperatures hot enough to dye and finish fabrics or process materials. So we're really focusing on trying to find the innovations that we can get to scale for that. Some of them are not that innovative necessarily. It's just working with OEMs and manufacturers of electric boilers, better efficient boilers. But in some cases, it's dry processing technologies or waterless dyeing innovations that have already been piloted and are proven to work. But it's the matter of actually trying to not only convince a supplier to take on a new process technology, underwrite the costs of that. Maybe they have to set up a second assembly line because they don't want to pull down the existing one while they get comfortable with trying out something new. And so there's a lot of costs embedded in that. So that's the kind of grant making we can do to partners that can come in and build out and run those programs for them too. So I'm excited about the things that we found thus far that are scaling some of the existing solutions. And now I think there's more opportunity to get innovative in terms of what's new. We tend to not want to focus on early stage because there's others that are doing that incubator, accelerator, early piloting. We want things when they're proven, and we just need to get them to scale. And then, the other ways in which we're using catalytic capital or grant making dollars here is around some of the infrastructure, understanding, how to work better locally with development banks, like leaning into the other unlocks that go around this, whether it's research and development on new technologies or innovations that are out there, so we can publish reports on that. Everything we do that we want to spend funding on, we want to make sure is made publicly available, but also is leading towards getting carbon out of the supply chain. So we're real careful not to just throw grant making dollars around on ideas. We really want to try to focus in on, these unlocks. Yeah.
So another part of systems change is moving to those higher levers. And you think about things like paradigm shifts. And one of those is going to be moving an industry that is defined by its intense competition to one of collaboration and cooperation on kind of shared goals. And there's examples of this in fashion with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, the Fair Labor Association. But how do you change those kinds of paradigms on how the industry should work together to address a challenge like this?
Yeah, I think since day one, we were set up to be this kind of convening agent that would look at, again, I kind of referenced it before, maybe not the early stage stuff where you might want to be competitive. I don't think we should compete on any of it, but I understand that some of these brand retailers like the press release that says, we're trying a proprietary new leather made from mycelium and, only we can use it and we're testing it out and it's going to come out in a capsule collection next year. That can be kind of attractive from a marketing perspective. And yet I'm of the school of, if it works, like, don't lock it up in some kind of proprietary relationship. Let's start scaling it collectively and saying, let's get this scaled in as many companies as possible. And so one of the ways that, we've established ourselves is on the later stage, the pre-competitive, boiler innovation is not something they're trying to gain some kind of greenwashed press release or some kind of, it's like it's like, that's not that sexy. So it's also, it is sexy to me because it's like the heart of the work. So I think just directing them on where we can collaborate around shared suppliers as well too. And it's really that later stage scalability, moving it out of anything that's proprietary and just starting to, put it into a pipeline for scale. But in and of itself, that is a big challenge, because just changing, as you pointed out, just changing the way things are made, and it is a real challenge because you're really looking at human relationships, and you're going and working with and meeting with suppliers who've done something the same way for a very long period of time. And they're not incentivized to change that unless they know that changing that is going to win them more work or continue to secure the work that they have. And so that's the other big piece to this, is getting the brands to lean into sharing that this is the expectation moving forward. And so you've got brand retailers that are making big proclamations like, we will no longer contract with mills who burn coal on site for thermal heat or energy production. So that means it's like divesting your portfolio at a bank of saying, we won't invest in any more fossil fuels. We currently have a lot in our portfolio, but we're just not going to invest in new ones. So we've got to start shifting from just that future state to like, now let's start divesting of suppliers that are using old technology or antiquated technology. And the solution is to be in the journey together. This is not punitive. This is not to try to kick anybody to the curb or, make suppliers go out of business. This is to say, you're important and we're going to work with you in this transition phase so that we can all arrive at 2030 where we've cut our carbon in half, we've helped you get there, and then we're also setting the stage for total decarbonization by 2040, 2050, whatever the company's goals might be.
Another part of systems change is understanding how systems connect to each other. My research is on climate change and human rights, and so I started thinking about the labor conditions. And Ginny asked, talking to colleagues on the factory side, it can be very pricey to make these changes without the promise of ROI. How do you balance the human rights and livable wage aspect with being better for the environment and allocating those resources? And do you work with factories on the social compliance and those challenges as well?
Yeah, this is great. So we currently are not working on any of the social and labor components of this, but I'll tell you, we sit in an ecosystem of other NGOs that are working very closely around that space. And it's important, I think, as you pointed out, especially because we're raising a lot of capital across different asset classes and bringing it in, that we're working with those suppliers to look more holistically at the problems that they're trying to solve. So all of our working groups are designed with suppliers at the table to help inform if we're bringing this finance to the table, and quite simply, it starts with the environmental metrics for like, are we also solving for water issues, especially in countries where we're doing production, where there's water scarcity issues, where there's going to be increasingly hot temperatures, and where you're looking at, how that embeds with local availability of clean and fresh water, because you're talking about factories that are drawing a lot of water out to dye and finish fabrics, put it back through. So the intersection of local and available drinking water, the more we can reduce how much we're drawing for industry and keep that water back in the community. And so one of the key areas that we're looking at as we move forward is, how can we start to cross-pollinate? Maybe we're bringing the money that's bringing the equipment that steps into lower water or waterless dyeing, and that also has a low impact on energy and CO2 emissions. But how can we work with the organizations locally that are looking at that input of, if you do fund and finance these interventions around energy and water, it's going to have a positive impact on the community. Then we can connect the projects with common KPIs, maybe even go co-fund this work. And so I'm saying this a little bit out loud in case this gets in the hands of some of the larger funders around this work, because we're bringing money to the table to look at the CO2 emission reduction and water savings and chemical management. But there's groups like Bezos Earth Fund, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Rockefeller Foundation, who's also funding us, who are looking at those just energy transitions and looking at the social impact of a lot of this. And my goal would be to start combining these projects in a way that we can do joint KPIs on those interventions together. Like we look at the two pieces, because we're not experts in the community impact side of it, but we want to partner with those NGOs or organizations that are doing that. And ultimately that might start with who's funding that work at a larger level. And I'll just kind of say a lot of this is like in real time being created. So this week I had an excellent conversation with a group out of India, ICC, which is focusing on India Climate Coalition Collaborative, and they're looking at a lot of these issues. And so one of the great opportunities we could have, and they're not just textile apparel, right? They're looking across India at large, is they are a great conduit to other projects and programs out there that we can partner with. So the more that organizations like ours are looking at joining these other coalitions locally, so it's not me sitting in San Francisco or my colleague in London driving down strategies, but that we're actually on the ground partnering with those local initiatives around climate to learn from them and to say, how can what we're doing combine with what you're doing, you know?
So I can't help but ask this, and I know it's a fundamental question and it can be an uncomfortable question, but the World Bank estimates that consumption of fashion is going to increase 65% by 2030. And I think that's the big mindset shift, is what does growth look like? What does consumption look like? How do you think about that in the space that you're in? That if it's what is responsible or regenerative consumption, I'm not even sure how to describe it, but
Sure.
the
Sure.
consumption question.
Yeah, it's the production and consumption. And you heard in my lovely bio introduction, which so they're always so, it's like so many silly things in there but they're all really important. And I say silly only because I'm sort of humble about some of these things that have been part of. But one of them that was really interesting was the future of production and consumption with World Economic Forum. And having done that, and then also having run the Cradle to Cradle Institute, which is a framework on designing for circularity, getting out of this linear production mode, this sector is really culpable in the space of overproduction. And it's you know, for anyone who's worked in this sector or knows a little bit about it, it's designed into the model to make more than you'll sell. It's kind of like food and ag. Like you lose like 20 to 30% of product along the value chain and value along the value chain, but you design it that way, and then everything gets in the case of food and ag, it perishes. In the case of apparel, it gets discounted, discarded, burnt, or sent to landfill across this value chain, right? And so at the end of the day, you've got all this overproduced, even that which doesn't end up in the hands of the consumer, you know, just because it's actually overstock, over inventory, right? And then you got a lot of dead stock coming from fabric that's overproduced and then not used. And so the industry is working on a lot of ways in which it can continue to make money, but also reduce that over inventory. And that's not currently what AII is looking at. We're very much focused in on this lowering the impact of the current production. But the elephant in the room is, yeah, but if you're increasing production, then your targets are going in the opposite direction. You can remove all the carbon you want, but if you're in, you know, 10% in that direction and 30% in this direction, is like, you know, fighting against itself. So we're well aware of, you know, this entire systems change approach that has to be addressed. We've got our eye on the lowering environmental impact in the current production work, and that's what we're trying to do at AII. But we're deeply part of other work streams and working groups in the industry that are looking at the production consumption side of it as well too. And never say never that AII wouldn't want to take on some of those other areas in the future. I think the one that makes the most sense for us is around circularity and looking at solutions for textile recycling and upcycling as it becomes an input also into recycled content. So from my cradle to cradle days, you know, in the pure vision of a circular economy, you don't worry about all the stuff you're making because you're making it with clean energy, fresh water, fair wage. And so you're employing all these people and creating livelihood and economic development. And then all the stuff has been identified as a future it's been identified for where it goes next in the nutrient cycle, whether that's a biological nutrient that gets safely back into the earth or a technical nutrient that gets back into the flow. The reality is you're in the transition, you're not there yet. And so all the production has, continued this burden of impact. But I will say I have not abandoned my own personal passion for designing for continuous material flow so that all this textile production gets upcycled and reclaimed and recycled back. Now, there's also embedded energy, in the logistics and the processing of all that material back. So it's got to be built also on a clean energy solution. And then the other thing that I want to address in there, which is happening in this sector, is looking at the inventory and inventory management. I find that some of these platforms that are being created for just-in-time production in the apparel sector are hugely interesting. They're also problematic because they're increasing how much people are buying off Instagram and TikTok and social media. And there's companies out there that are basically digital platforms for, I see it online, I click on it, it gets distributed to millions of other buyers and gets low bid and produced, and I have it within a week because it's air freighted to my house. And it was so low price point that maybe I just use it in an Instagram campaign I'm doing for myself as an influencer and then discard it. That's the horror story that we all hear around some of these fast fashion digital models that don't even have bricks and mortar. So it's even faster than what we used to consider was fast fashion. But I also think what's interesting in that is that you are not overproducing, right? You are overproducing. Let me take that back. You are overproducing because you're driving up the demand for all this product. But what you're not doing is creating more inventory than what's necessary. So it's matching buyer to production and presumably a one-to-one without bricks and mortar. So I don't have to have inventory. I don't have to have stock in the back. I don't have to have warehousing. It's all just in time. I think if that model can also be applied to medium and higher price point products, where we don't overproduce, where there is a direct relationship between me as the customer to the production of something that I've created the demand for individually, that is the future of getting our heads around creating the systems change around inventory. But it's a big lift, but I think it's very interesting.
I probably shouldn't share the story, but when you had come to class, I think it was 2 years ago, it was around Halloween time, and you asked my students how many of you bought Halloween costumes on Shein, and they kind of sheepishly raised their hand. And then you told that story of like, actually, they're producing on demand, that they're actually reducing some of that inventory. It helped them shift their thinking a little. Still lots of other issues, but they shift their thinking on the consumption piece a little bit.
Yeah. And I want to kind of comment on that too, because you can hear, I mean, and a lot of us in this audience, who might be in business school, having MBAs, getting MBAs, or, we're probably pro business, and many of us are probably pro capitalism, but but we also have to recognize that, we've created a lot of issues in the way in which we've built it, right? So it's about conscious capitalism and conscious production moving forward. And so I get excited about being on the part of saying, hey, let's not demonize any of this past activity or like say how horrible and evil these things are. Let's say, look, they're being driven by profits, right? And so we're maximizing, shareholder value by creating more ways in which we increase revenues and lower costs associated with it. But there's some really interesting solutions that are emerging in this. And if we take the best of Shein and models like that, and we take the best of other investments that are happening in circular economy and shared models and repair models, there's a future where all this gets really interesting, and it's done in a way that that doesn't create all this social and environmental burden. And that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to identify those things which are working, which we want to create more demand for, and we want to demonstrate that they can be profitable within the future business models of these companies. So I think it kind of goes without saying that's what we're excited about. And so I never really want to demonize the existing system as much as try to point out where there are issues we can solve, right?
And I love that. And I think that, part of systems change is, for me, it's how we teach business. And I think business schools have changed a lot, probably since you got your MBA, but a lot of it hasn't. But if we could teach a more regenerative form of capitalism, it might change mindsets and might come up with new innovations to help address some of these systems kinds of questions. Speaking to that, what should MBAs and prospective MBAs be thinking about when it comes to their own careers, when it comes to systems change?
Yep. So it's interesting. I think that we're in a really kind of amazing time to be alive, even though, there's all the reasons why you can point out how complex it is right now and on across all fronts. But it is, I think we are just primed to retool this earth right now using AI, technology, the relationship to how we work, where we work. And I feel like for those of us that are purpose driven in any way and believe that we're part of something bigger, that we're part of this big build towards a new future. And I know that sounds kind of, hokey and like put it on a Hallmark card, but it's kind of true actually. So I think it's hugely inspiring. And I'm encouraging everyone that I talk to find that part of like being part of like building a new future. I think we're going to look back in history if we make it through this climate crisis, which I am an optimist. I believe we're going to make it through. There's going to be obviously major impact globally on it. It's going to, there's a lot of stuff that's no going back on, but there's also a new future that we're building. And I believe in humanity's ability, sometimes at the 11th and a half hour to save the day. But I do believe that we know how to do it and we will. We just sometimes have to get to that most painful place before it happens. So saying that, it's a really creative time to be part of systems change and solution, and thinking about every company that makes a product or service right now is tasked with asking itself why it's necessary in society. Like, why do we even need this thing? And I think there's a scrutiny put on, particularly if there's a product associated with it, in a culture that's increasing around waste and like kind of mindfulness of not having a bunch of crap out there, is like, what does this serve? Why is this good beyond just economic, like creating wealth, right? Like making a bunch of widgets just to make somebody wealthy is one thing, but then starting to look at, well, how does that widget create a better life or a better society or whatever? So we start to really think through the purpose of everything. And I think it's an interesting time to realign ourselves to purpose and use that lens as we're building our careers, as we're seeking jobs, as we're building strategies of like, what is the purpose of this? And then it gets really a lot more interesting, because then it forces us all to be creative and looking at like what we're a part of and why it's necessary, and continuously ask that question of ourselves, which to me is like what it's all about, and being passionate about the career you've chosen.
Thank you, Lewis. That was fantastic. And that's inspires me. I want to pass things back over to Katie or to Jessica to field a few other questions. And then I have a couple more to kind of wrap us up. But Jessica?
Great, thanks. I look frozen on the screen, but I'm here, I promise. Oh, there we go. Well, thank you so much, Wes and Lewis, for that amazing conversation. We do have a few more follow-up questions here. Some questions around kind of success. What does success look like and how you're tracking this? So along the lines of tracking success of your initiatives, your investments, what does that look like? Is it in a category? Is it in a location? How are you trying to track your impact?
Yeah, I love that. So as the Impact Institute, which is in our name, right, Apparel Impact, and one of the reasons why I was attracted to it was that we could base this organization on a data-driven, science-based approach where a lot of nonprofit work sometimes is led from the heart, which is amazing. But if you don't apply a data-driven sort of criteria approach to it, you can end up, doing a lot of things that maybe don't actually have impact, and they feel good and they look good and they make good stories. But at the end of the day, you've got to get a little specific, right? So what I loved about us was when we wrote the carbon roadmap to net zero with the World Resource Institute, it was like, here are the carbon interventions. If you do this thing, if you replace this thing, if you change this function of production, you will lower carbon on average by X. This is how much is there. This is what you can achieve. And so that to me really satisfied my sense of like sleeping well at night with this very methodology, this methodology applied to it. So being able to follow the carbon is a term that we use a lot. Like, let's follow the carbon with all our projects, with all our investments. Let's lead with unit of dollar in, unit of carbon out, and that everything we would fund would have a cost of carbon and a carbon ROI, right? Return on carbon emission reduction. Water savings goes with it. Like I said earlier, chemical management, there's other KPIs that are critical. And the finance piece is also a great KPI for us to track too, like to look at. And also back to those partners that we're working with in the banking side, which currently we're working with Standard Chartered, BNP Paribas, and HSBC, along with the IFC and associated development banks that are part of that network. They want to see from an ESG reporting perspective, like if this loan was made, can you actually quantify how much carbon this loan contributed to reduction, right? And then you're able to quantify that. And so we're data driven. All of our projects are benchmarked. We track the carbon emission reduction month over month, quarter over quarter. We give those impact reports back to our stakeholders. The supplier owns that data, but if they want to release it to a brand retailer that they're working with, they can share that this intervention reduced our carbon by 13.7% in the last 18 months and yielded us a savings of X, Y, and Z in our water and energy bills. So that's information that we share. We also aggregate all that up as well. Similarly, in our grant making, as we're going out and we're looking at new projects and programs, we're getting tons and tons of proposals. And so we had to develop a criteria for what we wanted to fund related to carbon. How would we evaluate this? And so some of it is, we're building something that's never been done before. And so we're not going to be entirely sure all the time that it is proven, even though we believe that it is. But we go in requiring some form of proof based on a number of pilots that have been run or something. So how effective is this intervention, whether it's a color wheel to lower the use of fertilizer in the production of cotton that saves the farmer money on their fertilizer bills, but also lowers greenhouse gas equivalents, and it's measurable. Like, how effective was it in your pilot phase? Do you have proof, right? So that's one, effectiveness on reducing carbon and other greenhouse gas equivalents. Two is reach. Does this potential program or solution have true reach? So for instance, if it's a CO2 emission strategy for silk, which is less than 1% of the material matrix of this industry, we might not fund it. It's not to say that silk is an important material and your project isn't amazing, but I need to focus on the 70% that's made up of nylons and poly and acrylics and synthetics, and the other 25% that's made up of cotton. And then that last 5% we may not focus on. So we're looking at the potential for reach. If I go in and change an intervention in this sector, it's going to have huge impact because this is where the majority of production is happening. And then the third is ability to scale, right? And so if it's hugely costly and expensive and the timeline to get it rolled out by 2030 is not going to happen, doesn't mean we still don't try to build towards it, or we might want, but we're looking for things that we can work for now, that we can get out the gate, that we can get scaled between now and 2030 and then build upon. So scalability is important. And so being able to measure those things is really critical.
Thank you. I'm going to do one last question before we wrap up. And we've been talking at the highest level, the systems change level, but many of our audience are going to be going into kind of their first role right out of their grad school program. They may not be changing whole systems quite yet. Do you have any pieces of advice for people who are looking to start this change from inside of an organization who are maybe earlier in their careers?
Yeah, I'm gonna say be patient. I think the hardest thing to do sometimes is to be passionate. And we come out of education, our training, academia. We come out of our youth, I think, really passionate. Don't ever lose that, by the way. If you can tap into that part of you that's just the blind optimist, stay there as much as you can, but become a realist too, right? Learn how to take your optimism and translate it into operations. I was given the best advice from my CEO at Mohawk Group, which was, he said to me early on, like, Lewis, I get it. I get what you're trying to do with us. You're a visionary. You see the future. You can only translate this to us 5% of the time, or you're going to get tossed out, because you've got to understand how the business works. You've got to understand how people are thinking currently, what our drivers are, and learn us and maintain the vision and be patient and deliver it. And it's also good to be a little impatient too, but don't burn yourself out on the impatience, and be patient, because what you find is you wake up 10 or 15 years later and you see that all those things that you suggested at Mohawk are now exactly how they do business. And you see all the things that you suggested to the apparel sector 5 years ago, and they said no, they're now starting to go, well, maybe now. And so it just takes time. And it's really easy to feel like, but we don't have time because we're fighting against climate, we're fighting against all these geopolitical issues. And yeah, but ultimately, you just got to take a deep breath, get some rest, take care of yourself, do the things that bring you joy in your life, and just be patient. And at the same time, be a little feisty too. Like it's finding that space, right? Where you're like, you don't get too slow and you keep pushing, but you don't make yourself go crazy in the process.
Well, I think that is a perfect place to end for hope and optimism for the future. So with that, thank you so much, Wes and Lewis, for that incredible conversation and sharing your expertise with our audience. I'd also like to thank our attendees for joining us today. As a reminder, there are a lot of other ways that you can get involved with ClimateCAP, so make sure you're signed up with our newsletter. We've got our website as well as our social channels. They're up on the screen right now. And also, please be sure, if you had a great time today, please be sure to come to our next MBA Academy on April 5th with Allison Taylor. So again, thank you, Wes and Lewis, and all of our attendees, and we'll see you soon. Bye all.